It's Mr. George. I miss you. I miss seeing you. This is kind of weird broadcasting from my living room. I've got a couple of dogs in here, so if they start barking, that's a good time. Listen, I want to apologize first of all for the Google Classroom and the Google Docs and the Google Forms. I'm a real bozo when it comes to that stuff. Um, I'm learning. I've said "okay, boomer" to myself about 6 times this morning, and I'm not even a boomer. So there you go. In the notes that go with this that I'm going to upload, I typed them in Word, but when they got transferred over to the Google Doc, Google changed all the little arrows that I use to boxes. I think we can deal with it. So anyway, let's get into this thing on the Great Depression. Don't get too sad. I mean, it was a long time ago. This is chapter 22, part 1, and we've got right here we have President Herbert Hoover, and he's about to give a radio address to the entire public. And if you look at his face, he looks like he's scared to death. Looks like a guy that really doesn't know what he should do. Next to us, we have a cartoon, and it's a Hooverville. So hopefully you remember that Hooverville is like these homeless shelters made out of tar paper and boxes, and these unemployed guys are living in it. And so here we've got a couple of hobos living in Hooverville, and they're reading a newspaper. It says Hoover speech. So President Hoover's giving a speech to the public on the radio, and down here we've got the little comment here that seems there wasn't any depression at all. So if you were to AP party this political cartoon right here, what is the artist's intent? What's the artist trying to get across? Nobody? I think the argument behind this here is that Hoover's pretending that the Great Depression isn't that big of a deal, or that he's underplaying how dangerous it is. Let's get into the notes themselves. Maybe. All right, let's look at the stock market collapse. You can see on the chart that I've got right here is throughout the 1920s, especially in the late 20s, the stock market went up, and then, oh brother, we collapsed. So what we've got is in the late 1920s, there's a stock market boom, with millions of people buying stocks on the stock market, in some cases doubling their money in less than a year. And that takes us to Black Tuesday and Black Thursday. So we'll go with Black Thursday, which is October the 24th, 1929, when the stocks collapsed. And that's right here. That's this fall right there. And then there's a group of bankers that came in and put millions of dollars into the stock market to try and prevent a total collapse. And as you can see, the stock market came back up a little bit. I will just recently learned this. This is what's called in economics a dead cat bounce. That's a crazy term, dead cat. Down it goes, and then it bounces up. And everybody, hopefully, there's a false hope that things are going to get better. But when we went to just a few days later, on Black Tuesday, the market collapses. And you can see it was totally in free fall. Everybody's trying to sell their stocks, and nobody's buying because nobody's got any money. And by the time you go from 29 down to 1932 here, the economy is cratering. So gross domestic product, as you can see I'm pointing at it, gross domestic product fell by half. And the gross domestic product is basically the total value of the United States, of everything we manufacture, of everything that we sell. And so we were cut in half. Consumer consumption dropped by 20%. Construction fell 80%. 15 million people were unemployed by 1933. Now in your little reading, I know it said 12 million, but that was 1932. So as we traipsed on in 1933, 3 million more people. And you got to keep in mind that the population of the United States was only in the hundreds millions, 150 million, half of what it is today. So that was a staggering number of people. So what caused the stock market to collapse? What's the causes of the crash? Okay, the first one is uneven distribution of income. Throughout the 1920s, the prices had stayed flat. Wages had stayed flat, but corporate profits went up. And when wages stay flat and prices on goods go up, that's what you call inflation. You also had at 1.5% of Americans owning 33% of the wealth. So when the bad time comes, when people lose their jobs, they're not going to be able to purchase a product, which hurts demand. And when demand goes down, then the factories lay off the workers, and if there's less demand and there's more layoffs, and becomes just this spiraling problem where it just gets worse and worse. I've always liked this cartoon of this $100 or this picture, excuse me, $100 to buy this car, must have cash, lost it all on the stock market. Okay, stock speculation. During the 20s, a lot of folks tried to get rich by playing the market. Instead of investing in a company and holding on to that stock for a long time and trying to hope that over time the value goes up, they started to play this little game where they would bet on whether a particular stock would go up. And then when it did, they sold it for a profit. And this thing right here called margin buying, or margin buying on margin, this was really risky. This is where you go to the bank and you borrow money so that you can go out and buy stocks. And in some cases, the banks were letting people borrow money with just 10% down. So if you went out and bought millions and millions of dollars in stock in the stock market and you'd only put 10% down, if that stock falls rather than go up, if it falls, then you don't have money to pay back the loan, and it ruins the investor and it ruins the bank that loaned out the money because they're not going to get their millions of dollars back. Okay, excessive credit. Brother. Folks can get in trouble with credit cards now, and we know that. That's why you take the personal finance class. Can you imagine how bad it was for the first generation to have access to some kinds of credit? Folks in the 20s believed that the boom was permanent. And so you have an increase in borrowing from banks, and the first types of credit cards were kind of like department store credit cards today, like a Kohl's card or something. Which you did installment buying, which is technically today rent to own. So if you think about the 1920s and all the stuff that was brand new that could come on the market, you got the Model T car, refrigerators, radios, washing machines. These are all big ticket expensive items that people want. Everybody wants these things. Everybody wants a washing machine. Nobody wants to scrub the dishes or the clothes by hand anymore. So these are big ticket items. And you can't afford them all at once, but if you can pay just a little bit per month on this item, imagine somebody's gone out and they bought a refrigerator, they pay $5 a month. They bought a washing machine, they pay $5 a month. They bought a car, they pay $20 a month. They bought a radio, they pay $5 a month. Could you see how rapidly people could accumulate monthly debt that exceeds or comes to become a problem for the amount of money that they can earn per month? I muddled that up, but hopefully you understand what I'm saying. The expenses on their credits were almost as much as what they earned. So if you wind up with people not paying back their debts, they get overextended, then that hits the banks and can lead to bank failures. The government policies of the 1920s, I think I mentioned to you, you think 1920s, you think hands off. Laissez-faire. So what we still have is we're dealing with the tariffs. The tariffs, even though Woodrow Wilson had lowered them some, the tariffs were still high. They had been upped during the 20s under Harding and Coolidge. And so that hurts the farmers, it hurts international trade. The Federal Reserve, which is that series of 12 banks that maintains currency around the country, they wanted to stay on the gold standard. So when banks started to collapse, rather than helping those banks and getting money to them, they focused on maintaining the gold standard, and that hurt in the long run. So this should sound familiar. This is what's called a bank run, bank run. When people were afraid that their bank was going to go out of business, they panicked and went and pulled all their money out, closed their accounts. Well, it doesn't take very many people to start closing all their accounts for the bank to run out of its cash. And especially if the Federal Reserve Bank is not that's assisting, then this is a bad deal. I mean, if I went and robbed Commerce Bank, I'm not. But if I were, the most I'm probably going to walk out of that bank with is about $5,000 to $10,000. That's about as much money as a typical bank carries. It may be worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but most of that money is in the Federal Reserve itself. So it doesn't take long for people to ruin their individual banks. And here's the scoop. If you didn't get your money out of the bank before it closed back in that time period, you were out of luck. Your money was gone, totally gone. So what's Hoover do? Well, his personal belief is that everything's just going to be okay. Hey, prosperity is just around the corner. That's one of his quotes. Prosperity is just around the corner. The stock market will fix itself. It's not his job, he doesn't think, to mess with the economy. And this is a biggie. This is volunteerism, where he urged businesses not to cut wages. He urged unions not to go on strike. Told the charities that they needed to help the needy. This had come from his World War I experience when he ran the Food Administration. which remember they had like the meatless Mondays and things like that. That was voluntary. Everything was voluntary, and it had tripled food exports during the First World War and was very successful. When we get to the Great Depression, when people are out of work and everybody's looking out for themselves, sound familiar? Um, Volunteerism isn't all that slick. And he believed that people needed to be self-reliant at all times, and that the government action would hurt that, and that it was the state's responsibility, not the federal government's job to provide relief to folks that were starving. By 1930, the Depression goes worldwide, and in an effort to fight it, you've got old Hoover here pushes for the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which is the highest tariff in U.S. history. I think it raised things by 49%. Um, he's hoping that's going to help American industry, help American business. It does not. Europe retaliates with high tariffs, and what's supposed to be a thing to spark business winds up choking the entire trade of the United States and the world, and actually made the Great Depression worse. There's a system. You remember at the end of the First World War when we did the Treaty of Versailles and there were the reparations payments that the Allies demanded, and Woodrow Wilson in the United States was like, do that. Um, but the French and the British wanted this money because they had borrowed millions of dollars from the United States to fight Germany. And they wanted Germany to repay them so they could repay us. And of course, then Germany doesn't have the money, so they came to us for a loan so that they could pay the British and the French, and then it comes back to us and goes around. Um, I'd mentioned that I think I did a little thing on the desks where it was just a circle of money going around and around and around. And I posed the question, what happens if somebody stops the payment? Well, here's what you get. You get the debt moratorium. This is a suspension of payments on international debts, particularly some of the World War I reparations. Who's loaned out most of the money for the World War I reparations? That'd be us. So this is a massive loan default, and this is going to hurt banks, not just in the United States, but around the world. Hey, here I am, essentially where Hoover Dam sits. Hoover Dam sits right. Let me move my cursor to it. Hoover Dam is right about there, gang, out in the southwest. Okay, Hoover's response. 1931, he's going to increase spending for public works, in particular what's called Hoover Dam, which is one of the largest, most massive engineering projects of all time. But where it sits is out in the middle of the desert. Does that help unemployed people in New York? No. No. So you've got the Hoover Dam, and a lot of people, by the time you get to about 1932, are taking these words and flipping them around. Hoover gets serious, okay? So he's going to try this thing called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC, which is supposed to be federal loans to railroads, banks, other businesses. The problem here is that the loans go to big business. And what Hoover hopes is, and this is kind of this phrase, this trickle down, that you give the money to the wealthy and it will trickle down to the smaller businesses and provide relief to the economy. It might have worked, it's possible, but the RFC was really cautious. It didn't want to fritter away the money. And so even though they had a budget of $1.5 billion, in the end they only loaned out 20% of that because they didn't want to loan money out to businesses they thought would collapse. The point of this is to loan money out to businesses that are about to collapse. So poor Hoover. And we'll go to the farm board. He's going to try to help the farmers. Now, during the First World War, farmers had been encouraged to triple production. Well, how does Mr. Farmer make his money? He makes his money, obviously, by growing a crop and then selling it in the fall. Well, when the European countries ended the First World War and their farmers went back to the fields, crop prices came down. And so if a farmer in the United States wanted to keep the same level of income that he'd made during the First World War, he had to increase the amount of food that he was growing. And every time you increase the amount of food, that increases the supply. And when supply goes up, what happens to prices? And demand goes down. And so they tried to help out the farmers here to stabilize prices by taking and holding extra farm goods in storage areas, and they'd hope that they could raise the prices at market. This is a way too small program, and it doesn't help. So as things get worse, people grew to hate Herbert Hoover. You read about Hoovervilles, which I've got a picture of Hooverville right here. I believe this was in Cleveland. These are folks that used to own homes, and now they live in a cardboard box. Hoover blanket is the Hoover bed is a park bench, and a Hoover blanket is you're wrapped in newspapers. Hoover lunch is a glass of water. So just to mention my own grandpa George. One time I had called him up. He was in his 80s, and it was wintertime, and I called him up and asked him what he was doing, and he said, "Oh, I'm just hoovering." And I'm just hoovering means I'm doing nothing, which is the impression that a lot of folks had, is that this depression is going on and the President of the United States is doing nothing. So you've got angry farmers, the Farmers Holiday Association, Midwestern farmers that started to destroy food rather than accepting prices that wouldn't cover their costs. They refused to ship food to urban areas. Meanwhile, people are starving. So that's the crazy thing about the Great Depression, is that there's food everywhere, but it's not getting to the people that are hungry, because no farmer wants to give it away for free. He's in this to make a living. Labor strikes became violent. The Harlan County, Kentucky coal strike, where these coal miners went on strike because their wages were cut by 10%, and that's a tough job, coal mining. The governor called in the National Guard. They broke the strike, broke the union, and forced these guys to go back to work for less money. The Ford Motor Hunger March is an interesting one. There's a group of unemployed auto workers, and they're rallying to try and get their jobs back, and they're protesting hunger, and they march. They're going to march from Detroit to Dearborn, Michigan. But the mayor in Dearborn doesn't want them because the march may have been inspired by a communist group. Anyway, long story short, when the march gets to the outskirts of Dearborn, the cops open fire and kill 4 of these workers. That turns into a riot with 5 workers dead. You get 50 injured, 15 police wind up getting beaten. So the country is unnerved. And here's the bad one. This is the bonus army, the bonus marchers. And you can see all these folks here. These are all World War I vets, and they've marched to Washington, D.C., and they've climbed up on the U.S. Capitol building. They've been promised a bonus. In 1924, the Congress passed a law that said for every day that you have been overseas during the First World War, you got a $1.25 bonus, and for every day that you were stateside in the service, you got $1. And that was going to be paid out as a bonus check. So if you were in the military for a year, then you're going to have $365, $400, depending. Well, that's quite a bit of money by this time standards. The bonus is supposed to be paid out in 1945, but by 1932, the veterans want the money now. So 20,000 of them show up in Washington, D.C. and urge the Congress to pass the bonus bill, pay the money. And their motto is, "No pay, we all stay." And so they swarm the Capitol building. They stand around outside the White House. So when the bill fails, they build this Hooverville across the street from the White House. And you can actually see in this picture here, the United States Capitol building in the background there. Well, Hoover's afraid this group might become violent. There have been a couple scuffles with the police that have led to some arrests. There's some fear that these folks, especially because of rumors gone through the bonus army camp, that Hoover is sitting in the White House eating 8-course meals off of gold trays. And so Hoover decides, besides, it's not a good look to have a Hooverville right across the street from the White House. So he sends the army to remove them. That's led by General Douglas MacArthur, the Army Chief of Staff, and they wind up using tanks and tear gas to burn out the shantytown and drive these bonus marchers away. So using the United States Army to attack Army veterans? Good idea. If we went down to the American Legion Hall and beat up a World War II guy, I mean, are we going to be well respected? I doubt it. We'd be the worst people in the world. So this is a public relations disaster for Hoover. Here we have a cartoon. AP Party this. We have the victim of a bank failure and the little squirrel saying, "But why didn't you save some money for the future when times were good?" And he says, "I did. I did." This is the 1932nd Psalm. This was kind of pushed out, I think, by the Democrats probably. But here it is. "Hoover is my shepherd, and I am in want. He maketh me to lie down on park benches. He leadeth me beside the still factories. He restoreth the bread lines. He leadeth me in the paths of destruction for his party's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of unemployment, I fear every evil. For thou art with me. The politicians and profiteers, they frighten me. Thou preparest a reduction in my salary before me in the presence of mine creditors. Thou anointest mine income with taxes. My expenses runneth over mine income. Surely unemployment and poverty will follow me all the days of the Republican administration, and I shall dwell in a mortgaged home forever." Pretty powerful. All right, 1932 presidential election. Here we've got Franklin D. Roosevelt shaking hands with a farmer in Warm Springs, Georgia. Okay, most Americans figured something had to happen. We needed this is a change election, 1932. The Republicans renominated Herbert Hoover, and the Democrats nominate the governor of New York, which is Franklin D. Roosevelt, fifth cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. In 1921, Franklin D. Roosevelt had suffered an attack of polio, which paralyzes you. He was 39 years old at the time. He had been a former vice presidential candidate. And he's paralyzed from the waist down. And he emerged from this as a stronger, more resilient person. Franklin D. Roosevelt had been kind of a rich mama's boy growing up, and a kind of a flippant person. And when he comes out of this illness, it gave him empathy, understanding for underdogs. And it taught him that nobody, no matter how rich you are, no matter what, nobody's immune from personal tragedy or difficult times. And it let him understand, I think, that these hardworking folks that had lost their jobs and been unemployed now for pushing 3 years, it wasn't their fault. And he had real empathy for these folks. This is a landslide election. It's the biggest defeat ever at this point for a sitting president. FDR won all but 6 states. Here's this little thing about inauguration and the 20th Amendment. This is the worst winter of the Great Depression. Absolutely the worst. Unemployment in some cities hit 60%. The banking system's on the verge of collapse. And so to finish this up, here is the map. Roosevelt in blue, Hoover in red. The percentages. But this is Inauguration Day. This is March 1933. And here's Franklin Roosevelt. He's going to be going sworn in as president. And he keeps trying to talk to Hoover. But Hoover, who's just suffered this crushing defeat, would say nothing. He just kind of sat there, grim-faced. So Franklin Roosevelt decided he just wasn't going to mess with Hoover anymore, and he took his top hat off and started just waving to the crowd and smiling the whole way to the Capitol building, which leads us to this wonderful cover of the New Yorker magazine. AP party that, friends. Okay, listen. I'm going to upload this thing, see how it works. I'll try to have another one of these tomorrow or the next day for chapter 22, section 2. Keep plugging away on the Google Classroom with me and hanging with me as best we can. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see y'all later.